I grew up on a steady diet of Peter Sellers. And I to this day can't watch the beginning of The Party without just losing my mind. Laughter when he loses his shoe in that inside river that's going around the house.
I don't think I've seen that movie.
Oh, I've seen that.
It is. If you actually like,
we can't do that here.
If you like physical comedy,
I do. Yeah,
it's yeah.
Oh, over winter break, I rewatched Dr. Strangelove.
Oh yeah,
fabulous Peter Sellers film.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Yeah, and a lot of good actors in that film. What was the name of the guy who flew the airplane? He had a strange name.
Oh, it's
Slim Pickens. Slim Pickens. Yeah. Very funny. Yep. And the best part was that when they were making that movie, they didn't tell him to play it over the top. They just told him to be himself. Because originally that role was supposed to be a fourth Peter Sellers role. And when the time came to be in the plane, because they actually got the shell of a plane in a soundstage, he'd broken his ankle. Yeah. And he tried to get into the plane. He's like, this isn't going to happen, guys. I've already played 3 parts. Get somebody else.
It's too bad because he was such a tragic character in some ways. You
mean the real guy?
Yeah, people loved him. He was funny as can be, but he had these manic episodes where he just scorched the earth around relationships with previous spouses and friends and
totally.
And it's I like the idea of watching some of the Pink Panther, which I mean, granted the racist tropes that they use in them, but to see him dismount where he's up in the chateau and he dismounts, but he dismounts on the wrong side of the bar and he falls down the stairs and he comes up when he's holding a mace, a glove with a mace on the end. It's just such.
How old was he when he passed away?
Well, I was only early
in his.
It was 76 or 77, so he would have been maybe 60.
Yeah,
I don't think he wasn't an old man.
No, it wasn't.
He had heart failure.
Yeah.
I've actually oddly enough, I have the clipping of his obit at home. Yeah,
what?
Random facts with Yuill, but I was a big fan, and I was really moved to back in the day you'd cut stuff out because that's what one did, and so I remember when Charlie Chaplin passed away.
Oh my goodness!
What?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay. No, he passed away in the 80s, right?
Yeah, it was late 70s or early 80s.
Right.
Yeah.
I think that's a great segue to the podcast. Folks that are listening through the airwaves, welcome to the radio podcast. We're being joined, of course, by our usual host, Mr. Kung.
Hello.
And I am Mr. Turpin, and we are joined today with Mr. Yuill.
Hello.
And as you just heard,
we're not joined at the hip.
No, of course not.
We're far apart.
Yeah.
But COVID distances.
COVID is safe. Now, when you said fun stories with Mr. Yuill, what was the phrase you used?
Oh, goodness.
Just 3 seconds ago?
I know.
We can't roll the tape back.
I know, it's gone.
But this is one of the reasons why we wanted to bring you in and chat with you. And it's unfortunate that it's taken so long, but you're the kind of person that I'm just going to pop down to Yuill's room for 3 minutes. I got to ask him a question, turns into 45 minutes, and I come away with the most amazing stories because you, at your core, is, I've known you for not yet 2 years, but the thing that I know about you is that you, sir, are a master storyteller.
Well, thanks.
You've had a lot of different experiences, and you know a lot of people.
Yeah, you know a lot of things.
You know a lot of things.
Yeah, it's funny you say that. I had a prof at university who I think there's people in your life that you remember for all the right reasons, and there's some that'll be passing, but they have this massive impact on your life. And I had one semester with a prof in French who taught French literature and English, oddly, but named Floyd St. Clair, and he was literally you didn't want to miss his class because you never knew what he was going to say. And it seemed like everything was imbued with this sort of gravitas that if you missed it, you really were on the short end of I missed out on that.
Early FOMO.
Well, and he called it, we were joking, and he had said, he said, what I really appreciate, Dave, is you have magpie knowledge.
Magpie knowledge.
Magpie knowledge.
Never heard of that. Yeah.
That's where you know a little bit about a lot of things and makes you deadly at Jeopardy.
Yeah.
And it's true. I've got this my wife hates it. I have this inability to not remember useless facts. I just and I'll be like, oh, like this. And she'd be like, why do you know that? And I'm like, I can't dislodge it from my noggin. It's just part of who I am.
I appreciate the double negative there.
What does that have to do with magpies?
Inability to not remember useless facts. Yeah. Oh, that's a good one. So can I ask you, have you ever done the Jeopardy test?
No, it's funny. I had friends, so I can remember sitting and watching, and I think it's easy when you're at home because
there's no pressure,
right?
Yeah.
But I can generally hold my own at that. I do love a good trivia night, and I'm super competitive. I was at one point the high scorer at UBC in the pit for most of my first year of my master's, which I was pretty proud of because
I can
there was
imagine
a
that.
pretty competitive group that would go out there. That NTN trivia. Yeah, it was like, early computer and, it counted down and, So
you pay attention to a lot of details. You read a lot.
Yeah.
You're a voracious reader.
We always talk about going down the rabbit hole, and I see you doing that quite a lot as well. Really researching something to death.
Yeah, it's, I grew up in a pretty conservative house. My dad was a senior officer, and we didn't grow up with a lot of television, mostly because of the time, right? When television was in our house, my earliest memories, I would have been in 74, so I was 6, and I can remember watching TV, but you were encouraged to read the newspaper and participate in family discussions because you would be left in the dust if you couldn't. And if you were going to participate in a family discussion, you were expected to have a point of view and a well-thought-out point of view. So,
and this was your upbringing from 6.
Yeah, so I can remember, thinking I had ventured into the electoral process, thinking I felt pretty comfortable in, during the 70s and talking about Pierre Elliott Trudeau and my dad handing me a fairly significant humble pie, slice of humble pie with your clearly showing, your ignorance. You may want to rethink that.
Wow.
And not really kind of understanding why.
Yeah, right.
And
wow.
But I don't know. I've just always been a curious mind, and for me, I read. I've never been a big sci-fi reader, which has always been a regret. I've tried it and I've tried it. I just don't. It doesn't feel like where I sit down and read a historical text, time just passes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
and I can read. I've got a couple of favorite authors that I can reread their stuff and you get something more out of it each time. And to me, that's the ability to really frame and articulate an argument that this economy of words and there's such elegance in language and somebody who can really frame it and you feel like you're there. That's a gift.
Yeah. Well, everybody has their preferences, right? So that's,
yeah, that's fair.
And well, you mentioned growing up. Where did you grow up, and do you have any siblings? And what was life like in the Yuill household?
So I was born in Ottawa. I was the third of 4, 2 older brothers, and just happens to be 4 years between each of us. So my oldest brother is 8 years older than I am. Don's 4 more, and then my kid sister Alana's 4 younger. And born in Ottawa, but we moved pretty much yearly because of my dad's job with the military. So my earliest memories, my dad was a company commander in the infantry, and then he went to staff college, and he was promoted to lieutenant colonel, went to Germany with this notion of sorting out how the Air Force and the Army needed to sort of play better together, if you will. And then we were there for 2 years in Baden-Solingen, and that's the fighter wing, which honored part of our NATO commitment. And then we returned back to Canada. My dad was promoted again and came back as Director of Defense Intelligence. So we were in Ottawa for 4 years, but it came back in grade 4, one school, grade 5, another school, and then went to middle school. So it was by the time I got to grade 10 in Vancouver in 83, I mean, effectively it was like my 11th school, 10th school.
Holy smokes, wow.
So I was always the new kid in class.
Yeah.
Now, the military school, it's not so bad because every other posting you kind of would run into someone like, oh, hey, mate, we were together in Petawawa, or I remember you were on board. And it was this, like what Dutch people, talk to one another. Oh, Aunt Francine, and who knows, it's a good story where you connect the dots, right? Yeah. So that was a lot of my upbringing. We moved all the time. And so we were super excited when my dad was really getting what was a retirement posting to the West Coast.
Whereabouts was he posted?
Right here to Jericho. As chief of staff.
Yeah.
With the idea he was going to help the militia reorganize and be more effective. And there were some significant challenges, a lot of it due to cutbacks from the 70s and the early 80s. And I was here in grade 10. was there for grade 11, which was like a real gift. Like I'd finally had 2 years in one school.
Wow.
And I got called to the principal's office and thought, okay, what have I done? That list could be daunting. And they said, David, you have to go home right now. And I thought, oh my gosh, like maybe my dad's had a heart attack. Like he was super workaholic. And I get home and my mom's at the kitchen table and sobbing lightly. And I'm like, wow. But she's got an atlas open on the table. And I thought, well, that's very odd. And then my dad walks up the driveway. Okay, well, you didn't have a heart attack. That's good.
Good news, yeah.
And he says, okay, they want to send me to Damascus, Syria. I have to let them know tomorrow.
So your mom was looking up where this place was.
Yeah.
Oh my gosh.
To show us.
Wow.
And so my eldest brother, Doug, has been out of the house at this point for, 5 years. Don was in university. Mm-hmm. I was in grade 11, but it was my grad year getting ready to go into grade 12. Mm-hmm. And my kid sister, Alana, was going into effectively grade 8. And so, with a day's notice, we had to make a family decision, which, normally the posting message would come in and you just would move.
Right.
You don't get a choice.
Well, it could be damaging if you had a choice. Yeah. The point is the message would literally say, your rank, your social insurance number, or your service number, and then plus your belongings. And family was considered part of the belongings. There's always a running joke in the military. Wow. So, so Dad said, well, we can either stay here or they're going to promote me to brigadier general and I'll go to the Middle East for 2 years and come back. And so kind of like, how do you deny a guy to reach the pinnacle of his career? Mm-hmm. So
brigadier general, forgive me, that's the peak, right? In the Canadian military?
In the Canadian, that's actually a 1-star. So that's the first of the general star ranks.
Okay.
Yeah. It's one of these sort of historical oddities where the more grand the title, the more junior the position is. So it goes brigadier, major, lieutenant, which is sort of the inverse of if you were coming from the bottom of the officer ranks. Right. And then when you get to your fourth maple leaf, it's just general. So.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So we decided there. So I actually moved in with guardians for what amounted to a cup of coffee, and it didn't work out. And a good friend of mine's parents, I called them right before New Year, my grad year, and said, I'm in kind of a bad spot. Is there any way I could just come stay with you for a couple of days while I figure out where I'm going to live? And they said, why don't you just come live with us? So
wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, best buddy in the whole world. Who I managed to convince to join me in the reserves.
Wow,
that's
cool.
That's a good friend.
Yeah,
and so we I moved in with his family and graduated and actually brought my marks up, which I think probably surprised my guardians, who we just had philosophically different opinions on how the world worked. And perspective is everything, right? So. And frankly, to have ditched a commute from North Vancouver to go to Point Grey for school every day, that wasn't a real hardship.
So what high school did you graduate from?
I graduated from Lord Byng, the Grey Ghosts.
Lord Byng, Grey Ghosts.
Yeah.
Wow.
So, it was at the time a really, pretty, not a big school, like maybe, I want to say our grad class was like 128, something like that.
It's kind of like a Delview grad class.
It's about 750 students at Lord Byng at the time.
8 through 12?
Yeah, 8 through 12. And
hey, I TOC'd there. I don't think it's probably hasn't changed at all.
Yeah. Yeah, no, it's, the demographics of the neighborhood have changed dramatically. Mm-hmm. But, it was a place that, if you look back, hindsight being what it is, like those are some of the happiest memories I have was high school, because I met some people who, for me, it was really strange to meet friends who, you guys went to school together since kindergarten? Like I had never, conceptually, it was like, no idea.
Yeah.
Like that's for an army brat, that's, you literally have jumped the shark tank and whatever other, bad analogy you want to use, but like that was kind of what it was like.
Yeah.
Just didn't have a reference point.
So how do you think that affected you, being at so many schools, starting over so many times?
Yeah.
Living away from your family. I mean, your mom and dad were in Syria.
Yeah.
Now, what year would this have been?
So this would have been 85 to 86. So this is pre-email. So so Syria, former French colony.
Of course.
The French did them no favors when they departed. Really, from a perspective of like, you could phone my parents because we could phone, and it was prohibitively expensive. Like, a 3-minute calls was at the time was like $180. Like it just it seems grotesque now to talk about it that way.
Nuts.
Yeah, but we could telex them, which was like the early version of like a fax.
Right.
But I could phone them, but they couldn't phone me because they lived on the wrong side of the city. If they lived on the other side of the city, you couldn't phone them, but they could phone you. Like that's how, like, a classic French over-engineered problem, right? and a uniquely Syrian thing to say. Like people would be like, "Oh, you live on that side of the city, right? Okay," and like the Damascus.
How does that even work? It's just how the technology was set up.
I think
so you have to skip town and go somewhere else to make a phone call back.
Yeah, would there have been an opportunity to make a phone call from like the equivalent of like an internet cafe or something?
No, what you literally would have had to do if my parents wanted to call, Dad would have to go into the UN headquarters, and he had ability there.
Yeah.
But then it was patched out to the Golan Heights and then fired out.
Holy.
Like it was quite the process, right?
Wow.
Like I have memories of sitting in Dad's staff car, and Dad trying to check in just because of his job, and you're out in the middle of nowhere, and with old Motorola handsets, and him, calling in 9er Alpha radio check. Okay, here's where we're at. Like sit rep, as an update to, so headquarters knew where he was, partly because of his position. But I mean, Syria is an eminently fascinating place. Like my first memories are getting off the plane.
Sorry, when did you go to Syria?
I went right, probably August 1st.
After graduation.
Yeah. So I did a little bit with the reserves that summer. We jumped on a plane, flew to Damascus. But 2 days before I left, I got hit by a car outside my doctor's office. Like if you're ever, by the way, going to have a car accident, that's a super convenient place to do it.
Good job.
Yeah, not bad. Overachiever.
Yeah.
But so I showed up, and there's no way to let them know. So they managed to get a telex to my dad to say, look, David's going to show up on crutches. He's okay, as far as we can tell. But so
you got hit by a car as a pedestrian?
Yeah, I was crossing the street. I had to go. I had to get a last shot before I went over, and it was a gamma globulin, which was painful because it's in the butt cheek.
Ooh.
Yeah, so I get the shot. Doctor signed my book. I'm at a corner, and there's traffic, and I lean in to see the inside lane, see if a car, and there's some guy just comes whipping up, and he literally picks me up and drops me about 15 feet the other side. And my first thought was he's hit me into traffic. So I stood up, took about 3 steps, and just remembered like, wow, that really hurts. And then all these people were around me, including my family doctor. and then
did he see from the window?
Yeah, well, I don't know. I guess there was enough of a commotion, but anyway, I don't have a memory of it.
Right,
so
right, yeah.
Just, that was it. And
wow.
Then my last memory are they're loading me in the back of a ambulance, and basically I'd put my shoulder inside this guy's upper windshield. That's where it had hit, and it just sort of lifted me up and ragdolled me to the ground. So I had road rash all down my side. My brother was standing there holding a Slurpee thinking, what's this commotion? And he was picking me up to take me home. So he
didn't know that you had been hit by a car.
I'd been hit by a car.
Oh my gosh.
So anyway, so I get to the Middle East and I step off the plane, and you're struck by two things. Incredibly warm.
Right.
No
of course.
doubt.
Yeah.
But the smell, it burning leather, it's one of those sort of things that how you never forget it. And not in an offensive way or anything like that. It was just a distinctly oh, I'm somewhere different now.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
This guy walks up to me and I'm like, oh, this man is huge. And he's wearing a foreign uniform. And he says, Master David? Yes. And he said, how are you? I'm your dad's driver. Come with me.
Welcome to Syria.
Yeah, I'm on crutches. So he watches me trying to crutch across the tarmac. And it's I'm not kidding. I think it was probably 113 that day, but a dry heat, I always wonder why people say that. But he literally watched me struggle, and he just sort of walked back, grabs my crutches, lifts me up, carries me to the back of the staff car, deposits me, and grabs my one bag. And that was my welcome to the Middle East.
Wow.
Get to my dad's headquarters, so he knows I'm coming. This poor guy has to hike me up 4 flights of stairs, deposits me in my dad's office, and everyone comes by and says hi and that. And my dad just says, look, Mom doesn't know yet. Are you okay? Yeah? Okay. Don't make a big deal because she's going to lose her mind. On cue, get home. Why didn't you tell me? But it was, it was a really interesting summer. We saw a lot of really cool stuff. I mean, we were fortunate because Dad's job allowed us to travel between Israel, in Damascus, you referred to it as we're going to the other side, or we're going to Disneyland. And the locals understood that, there was something not available to them because, technically they're still at war. But we could cross at the Golan Heights and get into.
Sorry, you'd use Disneyland as a euphemism?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. Yeah, so in Syria, because they don't recognize the state of Israel.
Right.
And yet we would go over to Israel because, the Canadian base was on the Israeli side of the Golan. And, there at least you would recognize it as a much more Western experience, whereas in Damascus, I mean, we're talking there's a distinct sort of 1940s feel to like the country.
Right.
And yet some of the most beautiful, hospitable people we ever met were Syrians.
Wow.
Right? And it's like, and this is this sort of dichotomy of how they're portrayed in the media versus the actual reality of how it plays out on the ground. And yet I have crazy memories of being with my dad in the back of a staff car, and we watched somebody get abducted in front of us. And my dad just sort of said, well, this is part of life here.
This is part of life here. What?
We're just going to wait before we go and get a haircut because we were trying to get into this barbershop. And I'm not kidding you. It was like a 1973 James Bond Mercedes, 2 black ones, and they pile some guy out of a building right beside the barbershop and fire him in the back of this car. Everyone piles in, and one guy standing there with a Kalashnikov, not like pointing it at us or anything like that, but clearly like, don't get out of your car. And I was like, okay. Not like being in Vancouver.
No, certainly not.
Yeah.
So your experience overseas in Syria, how does that affect, there's a civil war going on in Syria right now.
Yeah.
How does your lived experience of being there at that time in the 1980s, what is it like when you hear the stuff that's on the radio right now?
Well, it's heartbreaking, right? This is Damascus is the oldest continuously inhabited city on the planet. Like it traces its history back 2,500 years. And what people don't recognize is it's in every sense a police state. Like the Assad regime came to power. It wasn't like, the Spring Revolution. They came to power in a bloody coup and have ruled with like pretty ruthless authority since then. And now being connected to the Ba'ath Party certainly is helpful. But I think of like the tragedy of like going to Palmyra. Here's a UNESCO World Heritage Site that is now never going to be experienced in a way that, I got to see it when I was there.
Right.
Or the water wheel at Homs. Like there's a Roman water wheel. Like wrap your mind around that. And you literally can park your car, cross a ditch, and you can touch it. Mm-hmm. Or being invited, like I was there visiting, and we got invited to this major's house for dinner, which was a bit of a big deal. And he was my dad's counterpart, even though my dad had a major general he dealt with. This guy was more connected in the Ba'ath Party, so you got things done through him, and he was very nice. He was really, but you never asked for anything, so. We're there, and he presents me with this gift, and it was a sterling silver bracelet, and with Arabic script on it and engraved. And he said, "Oh, it's from the liberation of, forgive me, liberation from the French." So they celebrate this national holiday. Oh, okay, thank you very much, very nice. And he says, "What's the one thing that you love the most about Syria? What's one thing you wish you could do?" And I'm a history nerd, right? So I said, "Well, I hear Crac de Chevalier is really spectacular. Alexander the Great builds this amazing Crusaders castle in the north of the country." I said, "It's, how lucky are you to have this living, like amazing history right here in your backyard?" Yeah. And Major Fauzi says to me, "Do you want to see it?" And I was like, and so don't want to be a bother. And
yeah, of course, right.
So literally get in the staff car. My dad's like, "That one might come back to haunt us." I'm not kidding. So we're home now. It's like maybe 11 o'clock at night. There's no TV to watch, but my dad's got like a stack of Globe and Mails that would be delivered from Canada like a month at a time. And so you would consume your news well after the fact because it would have to come over on the military flight and all this. And so we're both sitting down just consuming news because,
what else do you do?
Yeah, literally. And there's a knock at the door, and I go out and answer the door. And
sorry, what time was this? 11 p.m.?
11:15 at night.
Okay.
11:20, something like that. Knock at the door, which, Syria, you generally don't want to answer a door after hours.
Right.
And so we answer the door, and here's a Syrian guy in uniform holding an envelope, and he hands it to me and like takes off. So he doesn't speak any English. And I'm like, okay. And open it up, and there's a note from this major saying, "Please, as my guest, there'll be a guide waiting for you for tomorrow." So my dad's like, "Okay, well, I guess you're going." So my dad's driver took me, and we drove. It was like I want to memory might be getting this wrong. It was certainly a 4-hour drive, maybe 5 hours, and got up there. We had the castle to ourselves. Some guy in a suit, well, an older style suit, like a little threadbare, and that met us. And actually, any questions, spoke really good English, and would refused any payment or tip at the end. And
so what did your dad mean it was going to come back to haunt you?
So there was this sort of thing where, because the Syrians and Israelis were still at war, you would have every month incident reports, and you never wanted to owe one side or the other. It was this sort of notion, because the UN is supposed to be impartial and balanced, fair. And so if, for instance, on the Israeli side they had a flyover, guaranteed the next month the Syrians would have a flyover, and so violates the terms of this separation agreement. So that was the kind of thing, but you never wanted to be indebted to them beyond just cordial friendship.
Okay, so if they do something for you, then you owe.
There could be a quid pro quo. What is it? Right? And so that was it. So it turns out there wasn't for mine, but thankfully. But
that was just an act of genuine kindness.
Yeah.
Well, that's nice.
Yeah. So it was like it was such a fascinating time. Like, you could go walking downtown Damascus, people overwhelmingly curious because you're Western, so you stand out. And we'd have crowds follow us. Like, you'd have like 30, 40 people following you. You didn't feel threatened or anything like that. But I have memories of like being with my dad's driver with my mom and my sister, and he would walk in front of them. And some of the guys would reach out and try to grope. And I can remember like mom feeling distinctly uncomfortable. My sister would have been 13 at the time. And like dad's driver, he was Ernst Kloiber. He was the Austrian heavyweight boxing champion of the army, and he was a unit, like 48-inch chest.
Was that the big guy who picked you up at the airport?
No. That was another big guy. Dad's first driver. Went to school. He was a classmate of Schwarzenegger.
Oh wow!
And, it's one of these ones where you're like, it's like he's showing me pictures, and I'm like, that's actually Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Wow.
And he was a big man,
right?
And he's making jokes about Schwarzenegger because it was when Schwarzenegger was still in school, so he wasn't fully, developed.
Well, Schwarzenegger, if memory serves me correctly, is not particularly tall.
Yeah,
he built man, but not like a big man.
Yeah,
taller than me.
Yeah, so it was. Damascus was this sort of land of contradictions, and yet some of the most interesting things. Like it's the kind of place where to walk through the souk, where there's 1,000 years of history right there, and this sort of world that just exists. Yeah.
Do you think at any point in your life you're going to get the opportunity to go back?
I'd hope.
Yeah.
I'm not optimistic though. And I think we're at a real tipping point historically right now. Like, if we look at world events, and I think the world's becoming an eminently more dangerous place for a lot of people.
Yeah.
I'm trying to figure out how to get back to Africa, go to Uganda, and just to show my kids what I experienced when I went over for, my commitment during my community field experience during my B.Ed. It was transformative. And to see, and the penny drop for me there was, I went over there, I was going to do some PowerPoint presentation with these kids, and I had all these lessons planned out, and I realized it was probably the end of the first day as I was reflecting on my day was, boy, is that such a Western thing to do. I'm going to show up and give them the benefit of technology. And they were very polite about it. And yet the best lesson I had there was I had went to down in Gastown, there's a specialty vendor of maple products.
Of course.
And I bought like a 500-count bag of hard maple candies.
So good.
And brought over like 4 liters of purest, like best maple syrup you can get. I opened one of the tins, put it in a bowl, put it on the table, passed and said to the kids, 1 finger, dip it, taste it. Passed it around pre-COVID.
Of course.
And literally the joy to see these kids who never, this is like Stantal's an amazing educational place for these kids who want to be there. They want to get an education.
Amazing. Yeah.
And they, motivated, and some of it's rote memory. Like you see the such like naked privilege we have here. And to see a kid who's there, whose family is hoping that they're going to be able to help better the family by getting some kind of an education and hopefully being able to improve their lot in life, to actually have something sweet for the first time, really. and to see the kids light up and then explain how maple syrup's made. So I went through this and I was feeling pretty proud. And come back from lunch. So the staff ate separate from the kids. The kids are fed at this place, which is amazing. And there's like 8 kids waiting for me outside the staff room. And the staff room is
Do you have any more?
No, they're like, tell us, Mr. Teacher Dave, tell us more about the tree blood.
Tree blood. I love that. Yeah.
So, yeah.
Yeah. So you were in the military.
Yep.
When did you get into the military? And was this like, did you just want to follow in your father's footsteps, or is this a family thing in your family? Did your brothers go into the military as well? No, my eldest brother is a little further left than Lenin. And that might not be telling an accurate story. No, my eldest brother clearly had no interest or aptitude for it, not keen on it. My next brother up, Don, was keen to maybe become a fighter pilot, but he was going to have problems with the medical because he discovered he had a heart murmur. But I was the only one who sort of had any real kind of proclivity towards it. And so I joined the primary reserve in 85. And how old were you?
I was 16 when I first joined,
okay.
Just before my 17th birthday when you were allowed to do that. And then they made me come back at my 17th birthday because the rules had changed. So I had this like sort of like interrupted period, but rejoined again when I was able to. And then from there, commissioned to the Seaforth Highlanders of Canada. And I think for me, it was the connection to my dad because my dad was, often gone because that was the nature of his job. So I think that was the kind of tie. But being an Army brat's a really kind of odd thing. And I'm sure it's similar experiences if you said to me, oh, my dad's a cop or my dad's a firefighter. Like it's this notion of shared experience. And for me, I think it's just because the military imbues you with certain things. And whether you like it or not, you can't help but absorb them. The military school system is really uniquely different. So when I finally went into a regular classroom in grade 10, I was 2 years, 3 years, 4 years ahead of everyone in English, French, geography, and history, because that's something the military really valued. But I was behind in math and sciences. And it's just because that's where the emphasis was. And they probably couldn't afford better teachers, because, you're here, we're going to send you to this part here. Like teachers in the 70s, it was a real boon to be able to go to Europe and teach in Germany, because that was kind of the high water mark. But I think that changed. But I just noticed that my first year at Lord Byng, I really had to buckle down just to get passing grades in science and math, not because I'm not capable. I just didn't have any background for it.
Right. So the curriculum was different. Yeah.
And so I got out right before Gulf War I, so my timing was exquisite. But have maintained friends who have still served, and I've got a lot of respect for the institution. Like I think you learn a lot about yourself, and you can put whatever lens you want on it. For me, it was an overwhelmingly positive experience, mostly because it really helped me figure out who I was, and I realized I can find the humor in most things. Not a skill the military valued. And I just couldn't see, for me, I can tell you, John, it was literally, I was sitting there one night and I was just like, what's 20 years from now look like? I'm likely going to be a lieutenant colonel, major lieutenant colonel if all goes right according to schedule. I'll be a company commander or maybe a battalion commander if I'm really lucky, because there's certain things you have to do in the military by a prescribed age or you just stagnate. And I just kind of recognized when I met Corinne, it was clear she was never going to marry an Army guy. And I just thought, you know what? I'm going to go back to school. I had figured out by then that I really wanted to do history, even though it's like the least employable job on the planet. And I thought, I'm going to do my PhD. I thought I had something to say. It's probably what drove me. And so I went to school full time, worked full time. I basically got picked up by Starbucks. And I helped them open like 38 stores here in the West.
Really?
I just had this sort of interesting toolbox of skills. And so they'd give you the build schedule and say, here, we need this store open by this time. Here's the staff. It'll be merchandised. Get them all trained and away you go. And so I'd be training guys at our store all the time. And then,
what location were you at?
I was at Kingsway and Tyne, like in one of the worst neighborhoods in East Vancouver, because we had a methadone clinic right beside us. But Starbucks, their big secret was they're really good at negotiating leases. So this location, no parking, like there's a Safeway across the street, but like on a high volume Kingsway.
Yeah, I know exactly where you are. Yeah,
and literally they managed to get a sweetheart lease, and instead of doing a normal, which is like a 10 by 10, so 10 years, and then renewed for 10 years, they managed to convince the landlord into a 20 by 20. Because this guy had had a series of failed restaurants go through there. So he was losing money because he couldn't rent it out long. And here's Starbucks comes in and says, we will rent this location off you and we're going to guarantee you income for this period of time. And he was like, done, because he owned the building. Mm-hmm. So I want to say they were paying like $3,000 a month for that location, which is nothing, because our first day of sales, granted there's a novelty because it's a new store, we would consistently do $3,000 a day. So if you can cover rent on your first day
of the month, yeah,
things are pretty good.
Yeah.
So, but we had just like humanity that sort of went by. Like you see the best and worst of everyone through that cafe.
Right.
But
I just want to ask, just go back to the military for a quick second. Did you know in high school that that's what you wanted to do? When was the decision? I'm gonna follow in Dad's footsteps, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great question, Mark.
Because like nowadays in high school, not to say that everyone makes the decision, but there's an emphasis on, you're in grade 10. You need to start figuring things out. You need to have a plan for the future.
Yeah, I think for me, when I was on the base, you're around it. You don't tend to think about it.
It's just kind of, this is life. This is what it's gonna be like.
But for me, the tug was I didn't, and it's going to sound really odd.
Were you asked or encouraged?
No. In fact,
it was your decision.
When I left, my dad actually said, you're too nice a guy to be, combat arms, basically, was what he was saying.
When you got out of the military.
Yeah. And you said, I'll show you.
No, so for me, I remember sitting in high school and listening to guys talk about going to university, and they're going to be, my dad's a cop, or my dad does this, a lot of west side of Vancouver. My dad's a businessman, my dad. Yeah. And I didn't have a reference point for it. And I was like, I felt kind of like, I thought, well, if I'm going to throw myself in the military, maybe I should do the reserves first and just see if I really like it. Mm-hmm. And it was like lightning in a bottle. Like I just understood the institution. Now I did a ton of push-ups because I could make humor out of everything. And their way of showing their displeasure is get down and do push-ups. Mm-hmm. But yeah, so.
Can you take us through your first day in the military?
Oh yeah. Yeah. So I showed up, at least knew how to wear the uniform. And so they've got us all formed up in 3 ranks, so 3 rows of soldiers, both men and women, and they go down the ranks and look at your hat badge is incorrect, your beret has to be put on this way, your boots are terrible, they got to be polished. What did you press this shirt with a rock? Like, what is going on? Like, they're not allowed to physically touch you, but they can get right up, and they use proximity as a way to intimidate you and we had an instructor named Ivo Stohira, an amazing guy who had, like, when I say sausage fingers, I am not exaggerating. Like, he had freakish hands, but he would walk without swinging his arms. And it's the most unnatural, unnerving thing to see. So when I was an instructor, I actually adopted it, and you could tell, candidates would look at you and they'd just be like, oh my goodness, like it's unsettling. And so, so my first day was like, here's all the things we want to imbue you with that we view as valuable, and we're going to take away all the stuff we don't like that's part of your identity. Mm-hmm. And then we're going to give you back what we think you should have. And somewhere out of there, you keep a spark of what you were, and it allows to grow back, but within the constraints.
Take you apart and put you back together.
Yeah, but within the constraints of what they view as necessary.
Mm-hmm. So is it like in the movies? Like you must have had certain expectations. Well, you grew up with the dad in the military, but I mean, you must have had certain expectations of first day, what that would be like, first week. Yeah, it's
less profanity. Like there's certainly in the sense, like I mean, trust me, like you'll hear your share of profanity, but there was a certain like expectation on how they behave towards you. And it was very much like instructive. Like, I'm going to treat you with respect. You're going to treat me with respect because I've commanded it. I've earned this respect. And it's this sort of understanding the deferential nature of the military, and there's formal instruction in classroom where you're expected to, be on. It's so unlike what you would see in a classroom here. Like, you wouldn't have to say to the candidates, gentlemen, please put your phones away. That would be understood. Like, that's the kind of thing, right? So that part's different. But again, because it's the reserves, you go home at the end of the day. So if you'd been on a regular force course, you go away to Cornwallis in the Maritimes and you're gone for like 12 weeks And you have this intimate experience of, like, when I went to Gagetown, New Brunswick, and they send you out to Blue Mountain, which is really a converted World War I prisoner of war camp. And it was out in the middle of nowhere. And so it's not like you could run away because there's nowhere to go. You're like out in the sticks, like try to navigate it. And you want to talk about dark. No ambient light there at night. Darkest you've ever seen. And, we'd be out patrolling. You just they taught you to count paces so that if you had misread a map or misread your bearing, that you would know how to get back to a known reference point.
Just by the number of paces.
Yeah.
That's unreal.
Okay.
I got to ask, this is probably the lamest question you get asked about a place like that, but what was it like to see the sky?
Oh, so
perfect place.
Yeah. To recognize that there's this amazing number of stars we just never see.
We never see.
Yeah.
In the city, we just don't.
It's like I have memories of being in Germany with the Boy Scouts, and they had, and this was, I was going to say, if you were ever going to join the Boy Scouts, you'd want to do it on a military base because the parents are super involved and it's all super cool.
Yeah.
And they did this where we had to earn our green star, and they did a shooting star, and they had like a paraflare, and they tied it to a tree, and it was so I still vivid memories of being 6 or 7. I would have 7, I guess, but seeing that, and then sitting around the campfire, and one of the instructors saying, "Hey boys, look," and we could see the aurora borealis. It's never left me.
Wow.
It was just one of those postcard moments. You click. Yep. I'm going to remember that forever. So
that's so cool.
And being able to recognize in the moment that was something special.
Yeah. So, which a lot of, I know our listenership is a lot of cases W students, but I think a lot of young people today take some of those things for granted.
For sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, it's like everything. We don't tend to recognize what we're missing until it's not there.
Until it's not there. Yeah.
And we don't tend to value it.
Yeah.
Unless, it's had some kind of impact on you.
So you were in the military.
You were in for just over a decade.
No, basically my time would have been 5 and a bit years.
Okay.
So
and then you got out
because
you knew you didn't want to stay there. What was next?
So I went back to school, did my undergrad, got accepted to a master's program at UBC, and Corinne started law school.
Corinne is, of course, your wife.
My wife.
Yeah.
And so we were trying to make sure that we stayed roughly same geography. And then I was pretty serious about doing a PhD, and the War Studies program at Queen's, which is run at RMC, the Royal Military College, was that was but that would have been 5 years of moving to Ontario to do your field of study and then your thesis work. So it came to pass, though, I in 97 in open competition won a scholarship to become a Canadian Battle of Normandy Foundation scholar, and got to go over and spend 3 weeks touring World War I and World War II battlefields with other like-minded undergrad students and one other graduate student, run by a PhD from the Maritimes named Mark Milner, who's one of Canada's foremost naval historians, and just a corker of a guy to spend time with.
Oh, that sounds like the most amazing experience ever for a person who's interested in the history of Canada's experiences in the First and Second World War. That's Disneyland.
Yeah, it's I've reflected a lot about that time because it changed how I thought about my craft. And it really brought it home for me because what I realized then, so you can stand at Kitchener Wood and you can go to the main Tynecott Cemetery where, 14,000, souls are buried, including 5 Victoria Crosses. And it's a it's haunting, and it's built on the battlefield. So there's pillboxes you have to navigate up, row upon row upon row of headstone. And this is the Commonwealth. And this is from the First and Second Battle of Ypres. And then you cross the road to Langmark, to the German cemetery. And there's all these sort of basaltic crosses on the ground. It's treed and canopied, and it's very peaceful and very serene. And I recognize then I'm standing at the entrance. I'm maybe 6 or 7 parking stalls wide. You're standing on a mass grave of about 28,000 people because they didn't have enough to bury.
28,000?
Yeah. That's their final resting place. It's all bricked in. It's very tastefully done. And their names are represented all around you. And that's the moment where I was like, I feel kind of uncomfortable being here because the Canadians actually inflicted most of this on what the Germans still to this day call the Night of the Children's Dying, Kindermorden. And like they still remember this because the best and brightest of young German scholars and academics and young men went to war and were cut down by the Canadians during one of the actions. So it's one of these sort of things where the penny dropped was we were having lunch and this bus disgorged these other students. And so we're all roughly the same age. I was older than most of the group because I went back as a mature student, but I can remember talking to one of these German students who like said, your ancestors basically killed a lot of mine. And it was the first time the penny dropped for me that like there is another side to the story because we tend to gun everything through a Western perspective. And like for sure, German mothers cried and families felt loss and pain and suffering on this unimaginable industrial scale. But we only tell the story that we've been taught. Like this is what we know because
we get our perspective.
Yeah. And this is what this sort of intimacy of it. But then to talk to a German kid who's really struggling with this whole thing, and then he's on top of that, like, and we've still trying to process what happened during the Second World War. Like, how should I feel guilt for what was my great grandparents? It's the danger of reducing complicated debates down to simple talking points, which is, I think, part of why modern discourse is so difficult.
Very, very true. Very true. The way that I've always looked at the First World War and the way that I try to teach it is that there were two belligerent sides that were fighting against one another. But under the circumstances that the war started, it's really hard to say who's the bad guy.
Yeah.
The First World War especially, you can't look at that and be like, oh, there was a very, very clear-cut right and wrong, and we went to the First World War to defend freedom, and the part of it, but no, not the First World War. The Second World War has more of that. Sure. There was a rise of an authoritarian figure that needed to be stopped. You get more of a feeling of that from the Second World War. But for me personally, the reason why the First World War is so tragic is because it was people fighting against people.
Yeah,
it wasn't right fighting against wrong. It was people fighting against people.
Well, and there's this sort of like institutional ignorance. Like military and government are conservative in nature and not prone to quick change.
Right.
And that's just their inherent nature. And yet there was, 70 years of precedent in lessons that they could have learned that could have changed the dramatic amount of slaughter.
Yeah.
And we're seeing really there the first institutionalized application of technology, this sort of everything coming together and this complete ignorance and fighting really in almost Napoleonic era tactics, which is like so.
With modern technology.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Where, now you have breech loading weapons and,
exploding artillery shells and machine guns and airplanes.
The pain and suffering on now an industrial scale.
Well, one of the phrases that, and I don't remember who coined this phrase, but it was during the First World War, people showed up on horses and rode away in tanks.
Yeah. No, it's we were talking about it in socials today with the students. The Germans there's accounts of them fighting at Tannenberg, where the Russians were so poorly equipped because the Crown Prince's uncle had basically spent this money that was supposed to go towards weapons, and they threatened these peasants, basically illiterate peasants, get up to the front. We got to protect Russia. Mother Russia needs your, and them attacking German machine gun positions with sticks or mounted cavalry. And the Germans like thinking, what is going on here? Like,
the difference in technology and the difference in tactic must have been disparaging.
Yeah.
And here we are in North America. We typically, not exclusively, but we typically learn about the Western Front.
Absolutely.
And the Eastern Front was
poorly understood.
Very, yeah.
It's they consider it like the Battle of the Masurian Lakes or Tannenberg, depending on what side of history you want to stand on. But and even there, like there were still the Dolomites. The Italian campaign was brutal.
Oh,
and
yeah. And the Ottoman campaign, like the campaign in the Middle East and T.E. Lawrence, right? And all the stuff that happened in Turkey and in what is today the modern day Middle East.
Yeah.
I have to ask this because probably some of the listeners of this podcast haven't heard the story, but I love when you tell the story of your First World War wound.
Oh yeah. So we we had followed the First World War campaigns. We had already finished First and Second Battle of Ypres, and we were getting ready to do the Somme. And one of the things from the Somme battlefield was actually to recognize that it's just open farmers' fields today still. And this sort of notion of like, these well-entrenched German positions and, how the Liverpool regiment, they brought a soccer ball and they thought this would just be, we'll kick the soccer ball across as we go advance on the Hun and this was all going to be fine. And yet the first day of the Somme, like countless thousands die.
Was it not the most deadly day in British military history?
Yeah. So we went to where the Royal Newfoundland Regiment fought, and intentionally to see Caribou Park. And so the government actually has really done this well. They started out with one caribou, and they have a place where the Newfoundland have fought. There's now these caribous as sort of a legacy.
Like statues?
Yeah. Oh, they're magnificent. If you Google it, there's at least, I want to say there's 5.
Okay.
But anyway, this one on the Somme battlefield at Beaumont Hamel. And so you can walk through what were the Newfie lines. Now, they're knee-high now. But at the time, that would have been where they came up
trenches.
Over the top.
Yeah.
And you can actually walk down towards the German position. And what you recognize is the Germans have got a bit of a high ground, so there's a bit of a dead zone, but they've got the high ground. And like when they go over the top, they're like, it's intimate. This is like Napoleonic era distances we're talking now. We're not talking, we're crossing 600 yards. In this case, the Royal Newfoundland Regiment probably had about 140 yards to the German positions.
Like imagine a football field and a half?
Yeah, about that. And so we went over and sort of kind of just reflecting on this like brutal like pain and suffering. And you see the detritus of war is still there. Like stuff like they call it the iron harvest. Every spring, unexploded ordnance is given up by the earth and farmers dutifully put it beside the side of the highway.
I heard, and not to get off topic, but I heard that there is a regiment of the Belgian military.
Yeah.
And that is their sole purpose is to go around Northern Europe and safely dispose of unexploded ordnance from both the First and Second World Wars.
Yeah, I find that totally believable. I just remember seeing, like, randomly on the side of a highway, like a little stack of what are trench bombs, like mortars, unexploded. And just like randomly, like
waiting for someone to come and pick them up.
And
you
hope that okay, is it still inert? But we had went through this, and it was a time of real reflection. Like this tour really affected me. Like really,
I can imagine. Yeah,
it was hard not to be emotional. Like to kind of think about it. And I had written a poem, and my cup was full. I thought I knew their pain and suffering, the many and the few. That just sort of came out of me.
Amazing.
So we broke for lunch, and I can remember sitting, and I'm a big fan of Rupert Brooke, the poet. So I had bought this little Rupert Brooke reader, and I said, I want to really make it meaningful to me. I'm going to read every day. And so as I sat down, I felt this excruciating jab in my butt, and I realized what happened. I had sat on a piece of barbed wire that was poking through, and I didn't see it when I sat down. So that was my First World War wound.
And that is barbed wire that was undoubtedly there since the First World War.
Yeah, and on the British side. So, it's self-inflicted.
Friendly fire.
Wow.
Not many people can say that. Not many people can say that they have a First World War wound in 2022.
And so the First World War stuff, it's the scale and the majesty and the recognition, like as I walked through headstones and you realize I was older when than most that were buried. So this adage of old soldiers never die, young ones do, is pretty true.
Yeah.
And yet you'd see the odd one. And yet I always thought what would be an amazing PhD would be to look at some of the headstone, the inscriptions, because here in 1920, you're presented with this package, and the government's going to bury your loved one properly with a headstone, and you get to choose the inscription. And you'd read these gut-wrenching missives from people all over Canada saying who wouldn't be able to travel over to Europe to see where their loved child, is buried. And I just found it profoundly moving.
Yeah.
That how do you characterize somebody's life in this epitaph that's going to be meaningful? Or somebody would, there was either thematically like heroic, he did his duty.
Right.
But you'd see ones like mother loves you very much. Like, like just crushes you. And so I really struggled with that, like at the time, because I thought it was such an injustice. And then we went to the World War II, and I felt kind of ripped off. Like to go to Dieppe, this is a nationally important like event for Canada.
Very much so.
And yet if you go to Dieppe, you would be hard pressed to find out that the war happened there. Because
Really?
yeah, it's a seaside town and they've moved on. And sorry, the Canadians sacrificed. Other than a small plaque we found at the corner there, you wouldn't know that, Cecil Merritt won a Victoria Cross there. I stood on the bridge where he was awarded it. I pasted it out and figured out based on the photos that it had to be right here. Like that, but nothing there. And it's almost as if in their speed to recover some normalcy, they just got away.
Forget.
Yeah, they just forget. And I felt really pissed off about it because it seems so unfair. And the average citizen I'm fluently bilingual, talking to French citizens, and they were like, oh, you're Canadian, that's great. Now, if you were down on the landing beaches, people were super interested and we were Canadian, and thank you very much. Dieppe, that was, it was a bitter lesson for me.
Because there's certainly places I've been to places in Europe, in France, where they're all over us when they find out we're Canadian. They see the little patch on our backpack and they're like, "Oh, thank you so much. Do you need anything?" And there's like, maple leaves everywhere. Yeah. So,
well, I guess for me, being Canadian, like in France, is a great example. You can exchange that for goodwill.
Yeah,
it's a currency.
Yeah,
we were in this town where I'm going to get the regiment wrong. I want to say it was the New Brunswick Regiment, but scene of some heavy fighting. And so we're just trying to find a place to picnic. And there's this beautiful chateau estate, treed, and the gates are open. And so we think, it's private property, but, you think they'd mind if we got, because it was brutally hot day, but they had these beautiful oak trees. We thought, well, we'll just go inside the gates and just picnic right there. And we were in a big group. There were like 15 of us. And doesn't a car pull up? And this really fashionably dressed woman, probably in her, I'm going to say late 50s, early 60s, stops her car and says, "Est-ce que je puis vous aider? Can I help you?" And we said, "Oh, sorry, we're actually visiting from Canada and we're here and this is such a beautiful place. We just wanted to get away from the heat." And she says, "You're from Canada? Don't go anywhere." So drives up to the house. She comes back and she's got a tray of like drinks, cold drinks, and a shoebox, and it's photos from the war.
Wow.
And it's her grandparents' house. And she wants to show like your countrymen liberated this town. Mm-hmm. We've never forgotten. Mm-hmm. Still, I can feel the hair on my arm stand up.
Yeah.
Telling that.
That's an amazing story.
Like, and this was like, if you're here, my place is your place. You can come and stay anytime here if you want to come back. It was just this sort of overwhelming expression of gratitude. And
that is still felt.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's interesting as we move in the direction of, rightly so, in Canada, of truth and reconciliation. One of the things that we're learning about and confronting is generational trauma.
Yeah.
But it seems like in the same way that you can carry the negative, you can also carry the positive. Yeah. And there's generational gratitude. You travel to these places. I've never been to Europe. I haven't had the gift yet. But everybody that I've spoken to, Mr. Kung, yourself, or anyone else that has been to places, like Holland as well, you get greeted. They roll out the red carpet for Canadians. Yeah. Because of that. And is that feeling of generational gratitude that is amazing. It's amazing to think about.
Yeah. And it's funny. It's like, I think it's like we're at this really odd crossroads where, as these veterans, like, the Legion's a twilight institution. Mm-hmm. They're not adding members. They're closing legions across Canada because their membership is dying. Mm-hmm. And World War II veterans, we're within probably a decade of the last one departing, maybe 15 years if we're lucky.
I was going to say less.
Yeah. So if we think of who's capturing their stories and how is that going to live on? Now, I'm encouraged to see a resurgence in interest around Remembrance Day with the young, and I'm a glass half full kind of guy. So I'm hoping that through like the three of us being passionate about our country and topics, and like what we did at Remembrance Day this year, I thought was fantastic, and certainly really speaks more to the kind of country I think we should have as opposed to the country we have.
Yeah.
But I still think there's some significant heavy lifting to be done. Right?
Absolutely.
But it's the will to do it.
Yeah.
This notion that, okay, well, because it's uncomfortable, we want to confront it. Like, can we just move on? Well, that doesn't solve anything other than make you feel good, right?
Or does it?
Well, Some of them, I think it's just they view it as overwhelming, the amount of work necessary to do. And it's kind of like with Indigenous issues.
Yeah.
We're not going to solve this in a day.
No.
And they're not asking us to solve it in a day. They just want to be heard.
Yeah.
And so maybe we could go with an open heart and open mind and really view it as a partnership where we can learn. Because I haven't heard any Indigenous leaders make any comments or requests that seem so egregious that it's going to fundamentally alter my day-to-day living.
No, of course not.
But that gets lost in all the discussion.
Yeah.
And we tend to take these narrow talking points, you know, like, and I think that's the real shame, right?
Yeah, you're right. You're right.
So, yeah.
Well, listening to you speak, you have this profound willingness to spread your knowledge and to give people experiences and immerse themselves in certain topics and that kind of thing. It's obvious that you're a teacher. And you're meant to be a teacher. I just want to try to bridge the gap between the military experience that you had and then teaching. And in the middle somewhere, you worked for pharmaceutical companies.
I don't know. You know, it's a really great question, John. I found myself at the end of my master's really angry, if I really be honest with you, because UBC, I got accepted to this really great program. I've worked really hard, and they were like,
sorry, can you tell us what your master's is?
Yeah, so I looked at the military, the militia specifically, as a social institution in the interwar period. Because if I heard one more teacher tell me that the interwar period was just like, well, poverty and sadness, but nothing else seemed to have happened in this 20-year period, I was going to lose my mind. Other than the Depression, which I get is pretty overarching, but lives were lived, you know, like, so it just struck me as really odd that this was it was like a hidden history. Because it wasn't sexy enough, nobody wanted to talk about it. So, and when I got to UBC, I got literally the first day of my master's after I found out that I lost out on my funding. So I had to go back and go to school full time. One of the profs came up to me and said, "Oh, you're Yuill, the one doing cannonball history." And it was meant to be dismissive.
Oh, really?
Oh, yeah. Oh, 100%. Like, and he said, you're like 30 years too late. And I said, well, that's your opinion.
Yeah.
You know, I do think it's important to understand. I think the beauty of history is I think it's multifaceted in all these different layers. And the more you understand about the different layers is the more organic the picture. And now if we look at how historical thinking consortium views things, I would argue that I'm probably right, because we need all these different lenses to really get a better appreciation to see if you can tease out higher truths.
Sure.
So,
we need people going down certain rabbit holes. We can't just ignore parts of you know, just because it's not sexy, like you said.
So I found myself having sat through a seminar, and I was getting ready to graduate. I had written up my thesis, and one of the profs made this comment. He said, you know, in Canada, we haven't hired a tenure track PhD, basically, outside of Indigenous, which was really rightfully taking off. We haven't hired a Canadian history tenure track PhD in probably 20 years. And I realized right then and there, like, oh my goodness, I'm going to be a sessional prof the rest of my life if I continue on with this. And so I can remember coming home, and despite the fact I didn't have any funding and had worked, I was one of 2 out of a class of 18 that actually finished on time my thesis, which is their whole point. They want you to get in and out in time because that's a spot they can free up to someone else who's going to pay tuition and books and et cetera, et cetera. So that was great. And I sort of like, okay, well, what am I going to do? And so I took a job in pharma thinking I'll do this for 6 months, make a bit of money, and help pay off some of current student loans. And at that point, we still weren't married, but now we're, 8 years into our relationship and pretty clear, this was where the next logical step. So I got hired by a company called Aventis, which was the first of these sort of druggernaut merges where...
Druggernaut?
Yeah, 3 companies on one side and 3 companies on another side came together to form this massive... 170,000 strong company called Aventis. So it was Rhone Poulenc Rohr and Herxt Marion Roussel. So German and French companies came together, formed this massive company called Aventis. I get hired during this expansion, and literally I managed to, through a friend, get the interview outside of the recruiting agency. And so I met the hiring manager first thing in the morning. I showed up at his hotel room in Victoria at like 7, and he's just had breakfast and everything. And he says to me, well, you got a lot of experience in customer service and sales. You have a master's in history, military history. I hire science guys. But you've got all this experience. And it turns out he was a former teacher.
Oh, wow.
Like, here's the sort of the believe in karma and the little kismet. And I looked him in the eye and said, look, we have 90 days in BC to see if we're a good fit for one another. And in 90 days, my belief is I'm going to be a valued member of your team.
Good for you.
And end of interview, I go my separate way. Next day, I don't hear anything. I had sent him an email saying, hey, I really appreciate you at least giving me a chance to tell you who I was. Be keen to hear what next steps are. Next day, don't hear anything, and I'm dying. I'm thinking, I should call this guy. My phone rings at noon, and he says, okay, here's the deal. I'm going to give you 6 months. Nobody has ever asked for a job like you did. And so I'm going to do this. Don't prove me wrong. You're going to have a box of books show up at your house. You've got a month to get ready before we send you to Montreal for training, where you're going to do a month, basically, internship in Laval. And we're going to teach you everything you need to know to be an effective rep. So I said to Corinne, okay, well, I got the job. Guess we're moving back to Vancouver. And so she ended up moving us from Victoria, God love her. And I went to Laval and lived in a Sheraton for a month and studied every night to get ready. And every day you wrote these exams. So if I think of difficult things I've done in my life, that's up there.
Wow.
And then I came back, and the rest is sort of, as they say, history. Like, it was like, it seems so innocuous now to say it. Like, nobody told me, like, you only had to do so many calls a day. I just assumed, okay, I've got this job. They give me a car. I've got good medical, dental. I got to work 8 to 4. So I was out making calls all over the place. My colleagues were like, no. I went to my first meeting, and this is one of my favorite stories was, we're like 8 months into this company. And at like the 5-month mark, I'd only seen my boss once. And I called him on a Friday afternoon at like 4. And he's like, hey, everything okay? I'm like, yeah. I'm just a little concerned. Like, am I doing okay? And he's like, yeah. Oh, if I didn't think you're doing okay, I would have sent you back. And I'm like, oh, okay. So we got this meeting coming up in Banff. So he says to me, let's make some time for each other. Let's have a drink. Talk about life. Okay. So I go to this meeting. And so Aventis was a company that they love the metrics. So they've got all these charts up, and it's all PowerPoint. And so they're going through slides and that. And so everyone's kind of talking about this one slide that's up, and it's a bar graph. And there's one bar that is significantly like 4 times bigger than everyone else's. So the guy beside me is a senior rep from the Maritime, and I'm like, what are we looking at? I'm so new, I don't even know. Mm-hmm. And he says, oh, that's call frequency. Like, he's like, see that guy with the bar? Yeah, he's making us all look bad. I'm like, oh, dick. Until I realize it's me. So I was at that point supposed to have done like 1,000 calls. I'd done like 3,300.
Oh, wow.
But the net benefit was I really understood the dynamics of my territory and that, and we were killing it, like number-wise. Like we had this amazing medication with the right clinical evidence at the right time, and it was sort of, we took a business, like in my territory, it was like $1.9 million. And that first year, I did $3.2 million, like almost. And next year did $4.7 million. Year after it did 6.1. Like it was in 4 years.
You were great at this job.
And what you realize is, and the company, the compensation was really great, like as far as bonus and that. And so I said to my wife, like, I could go and maybe be a sessional prof somewhere for not such great dough, or I could kind of do this and we could maybe just continue on life because I'm managing these complicated business relationships. It's a ton of fun. Maybe I'll just try it for a little while. Well, and that became 4 years, became 8. I'd been promoted, got into specialty sales, which then you get to further. And for me, I'm a lifelong learner. So it was this opportunity to continuously learn in different therapeutic areas. But at the end of the day, I managed these really complicated relationships, and I was really good at it because it's the ability to depersonalize what are often some really humbling calls, because you learn more out of a bad call than you do out of a good one. Because sometimes doctors don't want to engage with you, or they'll just tell you what they want to hear to get you out the door. And I'd be like, really? Like I expected, like if my mom presented, I want you to use the right medication. So if mine isn't the right medication, not going to hurt my feelings. I want you to feel confident that if that patient presents and you're going to be like, yep, because we've built the right relationship. Not a popular view in how the company wants you to do it, because they don't want you to say, oh, you're in the business of influencing behavior, but that's literally what we do. And yet I was like, why, there's a way to do this responsibly and ethically. Why should we hide from that? Well, the reality is because not everyone views it the same way I do. Because if you're motivated by paycheck, you're probably willing to take shortcuts to maximize your revenue. So, but I worked for some great companies. I worked for Bayer. I worked for Ventus, a small specialty company called Fournier, which was taken up by another Belgian petrochemical company. And then I left at that point. I set up some specialty allergy business for this Canadian success story called Paladin out of Montreal. And that was my springboard to work for Vertex in ultra rare disease. And pretty proud. It was a $30 million business with a game-changing molecule that really, changed how fundamentally cystic fibrosis is treated. And then crippling travel, and just recognize that as my kids were getting older, it was harder to kind of keep that going. But you need somebody who's like 30, but you need somebody who's got the business acumen of somebody who's got 16 years of experience, right? So, and I just realized, I wasn't believing what I was selling myself. That it still was meaningful because it was the engagement with patients and with clients, but it was I get to fly to Saskatoon to host lunch today. Like these are long commitments, and you do that. Like, where my last year in pharma, I had 109 legs by September. Like that's a lot of flying. That's separate flights because I had all of Western Canada, and we were frantically trying to set up this business. And my new boss, him and I didn't see the world philosophically the same way. And I got a chance to get packaged out, and I took it, and then announced to my wife that, I'm either going to go back to pharma and do GP sales where there's no travel or little travel. But I think knowing me, I couldn't do it because it's not challenging enough. Like I would then start bringing on other stuff as a challenge because I needed work to be meaningful. And so I said to her, to be honest with you, since I've spent the last 16 years teaching clinicians how to use medication, and the penny dropped for me by dropping my kids off at school and talking to elementary school teachers, that they were so grateful to when I said, hey, what are you doing in classroom? What can we do to help, align our strategies so that we can support you in your classroom? And having a primary school teacher say to you, oh, thank you. And I found it so strange. And so I realized it's really about the connections with kids. And I kind of felt this pull to teach. And then I was having a glass of red wine one night and thought, I've actually been teaching for quite a while. I taught basic training in the military. I've been teaching doctors how to use medication. Why have I not figured out that I'm probably a teacher? And so I applied to the B.Ed program. I got accepted like pretty much right away. And the rest is history. They called me school dad my first year at UBC. And as much as we malign millennials, I found that there's some amazing people out there, right? I think it's changed.
Yeah, we like to give millennials a hard time. What, me? Yeah, me. Okay, fair enough.
But and this is despite the filthy lucre that we make as teachers, said no one ever. I really love the connections, and it's like, to see the trust, like it's this vulnerability you have to put out because the kids are just ruthless in their criticisms. They can see through phony in two easy steps. But it's when you can connect with a kid and they're hanging on you. For me, the greatest one, Mark had come in and kindly with my Socials 10 class at the beginning of this term and really talked me up. And they were all like, oh. And I was like, oh, I don't know if I can follow that.
Yeah, you could.
And I dropped one of my best, here's what we're going to talk about and here's why. And they actually applauded. And I was like, that was the greatest feeling in the world, just because Turpin probably primed the pump for me, but I was on form. Like, when you've got it going. And this is why I love socials. My career stuff is fun. The kids love it because I do different things, but it's like it's called How to Function in the Real World. That's literally how I've structured the course.
Well, that's what that course is, really.
And the kids who, if I look at the feedback, it's ruthlessly honest at the end. But all of them universally say, this was actually really worth my time.
Yeah, valuable.
And so that feels good. But my socials, like, that's my baby. Like, that's meaningful moments. And when I'm talking, I get stuff to say because I'm looking at this as I've got a 7-year window. And then I'm going to be thinking about what I'm doing, like with life. So I want my time to be meaningful. I don't want to make busy for the sake of busy. So
that's the best kind of teacher.
Yeah. I was going to say, it's interesting how you discovered teaching by looking at the patterns in your life and the things that you enjoyed, and discovered that you were actually teaching the whole time.
I think
and it's really interesting that like you had some pretty powerful stories to tell when you were talking about pharma before, of how you affected how those drugs affected the kids that were getting it, and the fact that they really needed to change their lives, right?
Yeah.
But it was just not something that you wanted to do in the end because well, you had issues with the boss, but also
like fighting with the insurers. Like, it's like here's a kid who, by other than the fact that there was only one kid in Saskatchewan, for instance, who had what's called a G155D mutation for CF, and it's not that it's the most common. It's just that it's one that is the most treatable with our medication, and these kids almost correct that you would think they're not CF patients anymore. Like, I mean, they suddenly grow, they put on weight, they can do all these things they couldn't do before, but their lung improvement improves by like 40%. Like in CF, if you could get 1%, that was considered a clinical win. But it was the fact that these kids suddenly stopped getting hospitalized with all these weird infections. That's when the penny dropped. And so here's a kid who's waiting to age into the indication. His mom is desperately like, oh, if we finally get coverage. And Saskatchewan dragged their feet on it because they're like, it's only one patient, but it was someone's kid. Like that's the part that I was like, and so when I took it to the company, I understand that business at times you got to take the gloves off and you got to stand your ground, because if you're willing to give this medication away, well then why would we want to cover it? We'll just wait you out and you can give it away. Right. And yet there's, for me, a moral obligation. If you're going to be a leader in this occasion, you're going to have to give up some. And the company's very much a U.S. business model. And they all were like, we're sympathetic, Dave. We totally understand. But if we do this, we lose in these other indications where at this point I was on a $6 million business and it was going to be a $30 million business. So by a factor of 5, the magnitude, this is what you could affect. And the only thing was, and basically, telling the parents like, okay, well, they're fundraising and they're hosting curling bonspiels, and hey, we've managed to raise $30,000. Yeah, it's a $300,000 drug, and it's like that's a month of therapy.
Yeah,
and it's like that's a really horrible conversation to have, and I've had it, and I started to think like this can't be right. Like, it speaks to a couple of things. One is we should have a national strategy for rare diseases because these families suffer in silence. And so if we can agree that, okay, universal healthcare is a right in Canada, why should we not have a common drug plan? Like, here's and if you said to every rational Canadian, and I would hope that the majority would be in that camp, that we're going to tax you at $50 a year, pick whatever arbitrary number, and the government will match it, we could take care of all these rare diseases, like in the sense of investing properly in them, and people would feel like it's meaningful because these families suffer in silence. Or hopefully they live in communities where they support them. But the sheer human cost is enormous. But I can remember going into meetings with one of the insurers, and like we had warned them, flew in a team, like we were ready, like here at full court press, where we've got everything, all my ducks are lined up. They stroll in, some coffee and donuts, sit down, and I recognize none of them have read the file. And they're like, okay, well, your next appointment is what, 14 months from now. That's 14 months where people aren't going to be on therapy who could change their lives. And that to me was the great, because they don't care. The guy in charge of hospitalization, he's happy because hospitalization is going to go down. The guy in charge of the pill budget, he's like, ooh, no, that costs too much money. But it's the family's got to take time off work. Person's got to be hospitalized. CF patients are in hospital like 90 days on average a year. In fact, I think it's higher. Like there's some really huge costs here that don't get recognized. And I just don't think it's fair that we should soccer ball it around.
So you got into teaching.
Yeah.
And how long have you been teaching now?
So this is my 4th year. I started at SDSS. I got picked up as a French teacher, and the careers teacher moved on to something within my first month. So I had like a 0.5, I guess it was. And I got picked up and they said, hey, this guy has got 3 blocks of careers. Do you interested? And I was like, sure. Didn't know anything about it. Spent the weekend reading the curriculum. And by the end of the weekend, I was like, this is so awesome. He had left me like directions. His syllabus was thin.
Yeah.
And he had left me like, I was kind of thinking I might do this and I might do that. And that was about the amount of direction. But it just gave me a blank template. And so that first year was tough because it was lots of long hours to and I pressure tested everything with the kids. What'd you think? What worked? What didn't work? Mm-hmm. And so I had this like live like feedback loop right there in the class, 3 blocks and as you guys know, kids are not shy to tell you what they think. Mm-hmm. And so by the end of that first year, I felt like, okay, my French stuff was pretty straightforward and fun. And grade 8s are pretty fun in a language course most of the time. But my grade 10s, this was like really like lightning in a bottle. And so one of the feedback forms I had that always has stayed with me was this one kid who was super hard to connect with. And I was like, by hook or by crook, I am going to make this kid a connection with this kid, good or bad. Let's just figure this out. And his feedback to me was, thanks for not making this course suck so bad. And I was like,
that's terrific.
High praise.
I take that.
That's a win. I was like, that's a
Absolutely.
win. And it's funny. I've seen this kid since, and he said, you're the only teacher who didn't tell me how dumb I was. Like, it was like, nobody gave me, like, not like we're like people are chasing down, but like nobody saw him he just had to be presented information in his way. Yep. And he was super introspective. And when he was engaged, he had brilliant moments of like, you're just like, oh, he totally gets it. But if you just said, here's the assignment, do it. He wanted to hear why. Why are we doing this?
Well, and where is the problem with that?
Yeah, totally.
Sometimes we need to hear why.
Well, and I think the danger in teaching is it's easy to get set in your ways because it's an exhausting profession. Really, like, to be honest with you, to be an effective teacher, it's really hard. I don't think a lot of people appreciate that. They think it's just, you just stand up there and it's babysitting and all these other terrible things. And I've never felt that. I think it's this like sacred obligation we have to,
Well, if you want to be a good teacher, you overwork.
Yeah.
You work the hardest you've ever worked.
You get paid a pittance of what you deserve because we don't live on a clock that's 9 to 5. You know?
It's funny, like my wife, I joke about it, but like we were comparing paychecks when I got my first paycheck for teaching. And she literally said, that's cute. Because I basically had taken like a 25-year step back professionally in compensation.
Yeah.
And I realized, wow, I've actually made more in bonus than I get paid as a teacher for a full year. Mm-hmm. And that was a really humbling recognition of, man, do teachers really need to have this addressed at some level? And I don't think we as a group do a good enough job explaining what we do, like all of what we do. Mm-hmm. And I think there's a terrible misconception by some of the public. And unless you know a teacher, you're probably not interested in hearing that.
When my wife and I sold our condo with our 2 children, we moved into my in-laws' house. And especially at the end of the semester, when there's marathon marking to do and report card comments to put in. And, my mother and father-in-law are like, why are you on your computer? Your kids went to bed hours ago. What are you doing? I'm like, doing my job. And they said, we have a completely different idea of what a teacher does now.
Yeah.
Like a completely different idea.
Yeah.
And I don't necessarily think I'm the best at my job. There are people out there that do it better than me. And my in-laws are seeing the hours that I put in.
Yeah.
Right. But talk about teaching philosophy. Can I tell a personal story?
Okay.
About teaching?
Of course.
So my children just finished on Monday night skating lessons through the city recreation and leisure program. And at the end of the skating lesson, they got a report card. And my 2-year-old and 4-year-old were both of the age to be in this parent-taught. It's called a parent-taught skating class. And neither of my children were recommended to the next level. And there was a series of checkbox on the report card, and it basically you need to have check marks in all of the boxes in order to be recommended to the next level. And my wife was looking at this and she's like, I don't understand. They never told us that one of the last thing is child is able to participate in lessons without parents being on the ice. The lessons were advertised as a parent and taught.
Yep.
Parents are on the ice. So
we didn't know this until we saw the report card. It's like, well, if we had known that was a checkbox, we would have stayed on the sidelines for the last 2 lessons because we were under the impression that it was a parent-taught class and we were meant to be on the ice with our kids. So, my wife's like, at the end of the day, Kyla's going to turn 5 and she's going to have aged up anyway. So we're going to sign her up for the next level because we think that she's good enough. But my wife was just completely blown away. And I said, well, the unfortunate thing is that this is sometimes what happens in education. Sometimes it's unfortunate, but sometimes a student will go home with an assignment. What's the assignment? Well, I got to do this. Why? Well, I don't really know. Oh, what are you being assessed on? Oh, I don't really know.
Yeah.
And then all of a sudden the student comes home and is like, oh, what did you get on that assignment? 76%. What does that mean? I don't know.
Yeah.
And there's so much of that, and to speak to that student in your careers class, there's nothing wrong with a student knowing why they're doing something. Mm-hmm. As a matter of fact, they'll probably work a lot harder if they know. Yeah. Rationale is a huge part of our world. And sometimes we need that. Yes, there is a functionality of life that exists where you just jump through the hoop. I don't want to do this, but society dictates that I do this. I just jump through the hoop. I don't know why, but I got to do it. I got to do it. But in some things in life, it's not that. And in some things in life, it's okay to step back and say, why?
Yep.
Why are we doing this way? Or why am I doing that assignment? What's the benefit? I don't have a problem with students asking that.
Yeah.
And if I can't answer the question, then maybe it's not a good assignment.
Well, one of the toughest things about being a teacher parent is just holding my tongue and telling my kid, just play the game. Just play the game.
Play the game.
Whatever works, because there's little we can do.
There's little we can. Yeah.
Well, and there's a like for me, like I don't know, like I think I bring a slightly different perspective to my gestalt in the classroom, and I'm always looking to improve it. Right, like. I will often say to the kids, how did that sound? Did that land right? Because if I don't get the response I'm anticipating, I often will, why? And my danger is I use often, like I just talk. And I love words. And
Really?
Yeah.
And you like talking?
But I speak a certain way. And I've had kids say, could you not say it that way? Because I don't understand what you're saying.
Right.
And was it the word gestalt?
Yeah. Yeah, no, but that's the kind of thing. And it's hard not to take some of that personally because I put care into what I do. And yet I recognize that I'm grateful that they're willing to share that because, like, how do you grow as a person if you don't get constructive feedback?
But I think part of your experience as a manager and a business person, that part of your life, you carry it over to the classroom. Like what you're talking about is feedback, right? And how important that is to take that and do something with it, do something productive with it.
Yeah.
And
it's I'm often amazed. Like we don't benchmark anything in education, which I find amazing. Like I can tell you
we do, but it's like all over the place.
Well, but it comes down to the individuals.
Yes,
and I think this is like as a taxpayer, I think, well, what an odd way to do that. Like it's like for me, COVID drove home a couple of really important lessons right away. Was why districts were allowed to all buy different equipment. They should have had like we have a technology crew here at the school. We should form that, and this is what we're going to do. We make a decision. We live and die by it as a district because there's efficiencies to be built. Like that's business minded speaking, and yet it doesn't reflect the fact that Apple products are eminently better than like the Chromebooks. But
you're going to start a flame war.
Yeah, no, probably. But this
podcast episode is brought to you by Apple.
But I'm not like I'm not comfortable fully in the Apple world because I came out of the PC world, and so I'm going to be one of those dinosaurs. I'm going to be Dave Bennett. I'm probably well, maybe not.
Oh, you just call him the dinosaur?
No, it's but it's really a fascinating thing, and yet I listen to others, and like for me, I seek out people like you. I honed in on you two right away when I first got here, and I was like, I want to get to know them, and I want to hear because how you talk about your craft is important, and students like they want to take your class. I'm looking for Mr. Cunt. I'm looking for Mr. Turpin. And I see it in the 100 different interactions you have with your students every day. And that's a great place to be in, where you can feel that like you're part of the community and the fabric of what's going on here. And students want to be part of your class. That's a really wonderful and powerful feeling. And I can name, like, if I could go through, like, I wish I was more like Van in some ways. I'm probably too easygoing, and yet students really respect her because she commands a certain amount. And so, but you got to work with what works for you, and that's part of it.
Yeah, you can't emulate anybody, because if you're not true to yourself, how can you be true to the students?
Yeah.
So what are some of the other skills you feel that you've taken from your previous life and brought to teaching specifically?
I can size up a room like no one else.
Yeah.
I can honestly, and I think
that's from your military background.
It's from being the new kid in school all the time.
Okay.
I can honestly it was like it's like a curse. I can tell you within 20 minutes or 20 seconds of being with someone if I'd like to go for coffee or if we're going to have. Like I don't know. It's like a defense mechanism, John, where
that makes sense.
I can size up people and it's like friend or foe. And that's how I view this world. And yet with students, I'm acutely conscious of wanting to make sure that I'm on the side of like, I'm your ally. I'm going to support you until such time that it doesn't make sense. And then we're going to have to redefine this. But I'm clear with students about boundaries. Like I'm super easygoing until you cross here's Yuill's line in the sand. And I absolutely am a nice guy until you've yanked my chain, and then I've got a good Scottish obstinate temper. Which
with a military voice.
Yeah, so
don't make me use my army voice.
Yeah, it's but I just find for me the big revelation in education was all the different hills that you can die on, and recognizing that there's not many I think I want to, because for assessment's one of them. I was like all wrapped up in everything I was, so meaningful I gave kids. And I realized I'm just punishing myself with all this marking all the time. And yet I have stuff I want you to do that we will assess. And here's some stuff I want you because the process is important.
Right.
That's really and when I finally figured that out, thank you for Mark Woloshin and then having talks with you two, it finally made sense. And I had last year probably my best year in the sense of like, okay, I'm not working till midnight every night trying to mark stuff that really was an in-class activity. But because it's like I've canonized it by handing it over to you in paper format, and now I have to accord it this respect.
Yep.
So
I like the way you worded that. This is canon.
So
yes.
I think that was for me a big revelation, because I've had a couple of kids who couldn't string a sentence together to save their life. But if you sat down and had a conversation, they can do a pretty impressive job in communicating curricular competencies. Well, who am I to decide that that's wrong?
That's what we do in innovation class. When we allow students to come back and reassess, a lot of times the reassessment is oral. Hey, here's the test that we gave you, and here's the learning targets that were missed. We didn't get enough evidence to see that you've met this competency. Why don't you stand there by the whiteboard? Here, I'll hand you this whiteboard marker. Talk me through this.
Well, a lot of times those I feel are even better evidence.
Oh yeah,
right? Than some of the things that we do assess in class. Like when you can have a conversation about a topic and they can explain everything, they can draw diagrams and they can bring out examples from their life. Yeah, that's what you want.
The beauty of a test is that you can have 30 students writing it simultaneously.
Right.
If you
logistics.
If you could have 30 students simultaneously having a conversation with you, drawing diagrams and having that connection, then we would never do tests again. Yeah. Right. But it's just, it's unfortunate, but we live in a society where it is a numbers game. Yeah. And despite the fact that we never, ever, ever want to think about it this way, and I personally choose not to, every student walks in the building with a dollar sign on their head and they're a number. Yeah. Right. And that's not for my pay grade to worry about. I worry about the human, and I worry about what does the human know. Yeah. But there is a level, and even us as staff, there's a level where we're just a number too. And we're part of this big machine. But in spite of all of the challenges and in spite of all of the things that you could dwell on and be down upon, at the end of the day, we do a pretty damn good job with what we've got.
Yeah.
And we make some incredibly meaningful connections with some students that are so, so important.
Yeah.
So, Dave, it sounds like you found what you were meant to do.
Yeah, it feels like a comfy pair of slippers and house coat.
But what's kind of interesting is that you're here now in your slippers and your house coat, but you kind of been doing this all along. It's to hear you talk about it, I completely agree with John that you've always been a teacher.
Yeah, it's
and you've been tempted back.
Yeah,
you have been tempted back.
Yeah, it's funny, and it was, I guess the strange thing was to actually tell somebody, like, no, I'm actually, for the first time really in a long time, I've been professionally happy. Don't get me wrong. And some of my happiest moments, I can remember wearing a uniform because it's shared experience.
Yes.
And yet I have never had more satisfaction from my job than what I'm doing currently, right now, today. Because I don't jump out of bed in the morning and think, I'm going to make this today. I'm going to jump out of the bed in the morning and I'm going to say, how can I do it different?
Yeah.
What can I improve on yesterday?
Yeah.
Because I think about this deeply all the time. I don't understand those who can't. That's the part, because it must be an awful place to be at if you're an educator and you can't be self-reflective. And that was the thing I had an issue with at UBC. It became a running joke, was they were like, the reflective practitioner. And I was like, you guys shovel assignment after assignment at us and expect us to reflect on it when we don't have time to do citations. It seems perverse that you say that. And yet I found I did all my reflecting because I had to commute back to Tawasin every day. And so that was my time where I turned my phone off and I would just reflect on kind of the shape of what my day was. Yeah. And it helped inform how I was going to go about things. And for me, the big change was probably 10, 15 years ago. I just decided that all the sort of unresolved anger and issues and just was too much to carry. And I was going to go back because most people would say, oh, Dave's a super nice guy. And I actually really am. I don't suffer fools gladly, which I recognize as a character flaw, but I'm working on it. But I think I'm a pretty nice guy. And I've tried to treat everyone with kindness because that's what I hope I get back. If you send that out, hopefully that's what comes back to you. And when I started doing that, I just found life was easier. It was so much more pleasant. So, yeah.
I'm not sure if I've ever told you, Dave, the story of my great-grandfather. My great-grandfather owned a men's clothing store in Vancouver. Originally, the business started in Medicine Hat, and then they moved out west to Vancouver. And I'm going to give you an address, and I want you to think about this. They were on the 600 block of Granville Street, which is between Dunsmuir and Georgia. When the business was sold in the 1950s, the building that the business was in was eventually torn down to make way for Pacific Center.
Yeah.
That's the kind of real estate, and I'm sure they got a pittance for it when they sold it. Anyways, that great-grandfather lived to be 103 years old. Yeah. And when he died, it was literally just his heart gave out. And his eyes were not great. But other than that, he was pretty healthy. Smoked like a chimney, drank like a fish, and ate like a glutton. But he lived to be 103. And his own son, my paternal grandfather, I never met. He passed away at 50 years old when my own dad was, I think, 17 or 18. Wow. So I missed my great-grandfather by a year, but my brother got to meet him. And there's photos of my brother being held by my great-grandfather. But my dad remembers on his 103rd birthday going up to him and saying, Gramps, no disrespect, but I got to ask, how the hell did you get to 103? With the life that you live in terms of smoking and drinking, all this kind of stuff. And he looked at my dad and he said, I woke up every morning during my professional life and I put my 2 feet on the floor and I loved going to work. I loved, it was two brothers. My I guess it would be great uncle was the other business owner. He took care of the paperwork. My great grandfather sold men's clothing. He was on the sales floor, haberdashery, hats, shoes, jackets, suits, you name it. He's like, I loved connecting with people. I loved selling clothes. It was my life, and I loved every second of it. Yeah. He lived to be 103. My own wife gets mad at me some days when she's like, even in the summertime, I'll be on my computer. My wife would be like, what are you doing? I'll be like, I'm planning a lesson. I've had this idea. I'm going to try this out in September. She's like, how is it fair that you love your job so much? And it's interesting because I'm not trying to say this to brag. It's not that I think I'm very good at my job, and it's not even that the job doesn't have its difficulties, because there are some times when I go home and I curse this job and oh God, students, teachers, system. What I value is the challenge that comes from this job every day, and that feeling that I get when I leave the building and I get into my car and I think, how do I do it better tomorrow? How do we do it better tomorrow? And it's that ever ending. It's like that you see in the cartoon show where like you think you're getting close to the end of the tunnel, but then as you get closer, the tunnel keeps getting longer and longer. But the reward is not in reaching the destination. The reward is in finding the better way to do it and to never being satisfied with the way you did it yesterday.
Yeah.
And like that's you on your journey,
And you have to do that. It changes from year to year. Of course, the dynamics of the classroom, the students that you get, and there's so many different,
If I think of when I left the military and I got into sales before I went back to university, and it was just and I was really good at it because it was like understanding, listening to people. And I tell the story of I met this guy. I was up in Whistler, and I was manager at Kansky across from the Chateau Whistler, and this really impeccably put together, distinguished looking gentleman came in and just making polite small talk. And he's like, "Oh, this jacket, this is outrageous. Like, it's beautiful. Look at this. This jacket is $1,800. And I'm like, yeah, it is. It's a Bogner. Like, this is the couture
the line,
meets fit and function. And like, this is like, you'll have this jacket for 20 years. Like, this is like you're buying like top of the line German winter clothing." So, chatting away, he's like, "Well, I can never $1,800 for a jacket." Okay. I'm like, "So what do you do?" He's, "I'm a producer. I'm up from California. I've heard about this place." And I'm like, "Oh yeah." I'm like, "Well, what's your hobby?" He goes, "Well, I collect Ferraris." I'm like,
"Okay."
Pardon? He's like, "Yeah." He's like, "Just a sec." So this is like early cell phone days.
Yeah.
He pulls out a brick.
The Nokia,
phones. And hey, bring the album. "Yeah, no, I'm here." "No." "Yeah, it's okay. Look out the window. Yeah. See that store in the corner? We're in there. Yeah, come on over." So I wait, and we're making polite small talk, and he's like, "Yeah, I've got like 7 Ferraris." And I'm like, 7 Ferraris?
How do you have 7 Ferraris and can't buy an $1,800 jacket?
So this incredibly attractive young lady comes in, and it turns out this is his spouse. And there's probably a 35-year age difference at least. And she's carrying a binder. So this is like 1990, winter of 1990. So she puts this on the counter, and like the store's dead. Like it's October. And so it's past Canadian Thanksgiving. The ski season has not really kicked off yet, and it's been raining. So Whistler itself is dead. And so she puts this down on the counter, and he opens it up, and there's a photo of all his Ferraris together. And 5 of them are yellow. And he says, "What I love about that jacket is you see how close the color it is match to my Ferraris." And I said, "So let me guess, you bought the Ferraris because they get good gas miles?" He not only bought the jacket, he bought the pants and bought his wife an outfit. And that's when I realized if you know how to frame something, and I just, people say it's the gift of the gab, but it's understanding like in the moment, the right thing to say, the right way to frame it. So, and I've been pretty lucky, but I'm pretty good at it. So,
and it wasn't a swindle; like it was true for that guy.
Yeah.
Right?
It's like the ability to really turn an elegant phrase to really synthesize what you're trying to say. And the beauty of pharma was taking this complicated scientific literature and distilling it down into an easily understood, positionally situational, and appropriate message that a clinician who's busy as hell could say, "Oh, I totally get it." That was my secret power, and never told anyone.
Did you ever wear a cape?
No.
And that's terrific for teaching.
Oh, 100%.
To be able to communicate that way.
That's Richard Feynman to a T.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and this is part of the reason why I think for me history is so exciting is the ability to. I said it today is like we're watching this. There's a great 5-part series out that was done by TV Ontario and a couple of other stakeholders, and it's like the Reader's Digest version of the First World War. So at least now you can do it in class, and it's 5 hours. And I did some guiding questions. hyperlink, and the kids can do it at their own pace. But it's more just to expose them to it as a break from what's a pretty frenetic pace in the class. And one of the things I said was, the thing about this is we can draw direct parallels to what's going on in the Ukraine right now. If you can understand this seminal event in the 20th century, and I don't think you can understand the 20th century without understanding the First World War any more than you can if you don't understand the rise of the women's movement, the peace movement, labor, like all these disparate threads can be tied together and brought forward to help inform our today. And Liam, who was like, I could see, he was like totally like, he was like, I get exactly what you're saying. Mm-hmm. And that's that moment, that intimate moment where you recognize that, yeah, they're getting it. And it's like light bulbs are going on.
Yep.
It's fabulous feeling. So
that's the reward that you get.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And not many professions get that.
No, it's true.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm gonna try to bring this to a close.
Yeah.
Because we could go on for days, but we will have to do that off record.
No, but I said almost an hour ago that we should do a part 2, and you said no, let's just make it one long episode. And I said, okay, I'm game. And here we are, almost an hour later, and now I'm saying, so when are we doing part 2?
Soon.
Yeah,
look forward to it.
What's that podcast where it's just the guys having a conversation?
That's what we're doing.
Yeah, but what is
This
that?
is it.
The one.
This is the one.
No, it's not. What's the one that we showed our innovation students?
I forget what you call it.
No, but it's a conversational podcast. What's it called?
Which one are you talking about?
It has the word know or knowledge in it. The more
Stuff you should know?
Stuff you should know.
Oh, yeah. One of my favorites.
Yeah, stuff you should know. Like, it's just a podcast. It's literally 2 guys that just sit down and have a conversation. Now, we're 3 guys.
We'll need to create a separate
sub podcast.
Yeah,
This has been the inspiration. Like, radio will continue to live on, but I think the 3 of us together is a separate podcast.
Yeah. In the meantime, thanks for joining us today.
Yeah, this was a lot of fun. That was
terrific.
Great chatting with you.
Thanks.
Your students are very lucky. Oh, we're lucky to have you here.
So lucky.
John.
Please stick around.
Mm-hmm. Don't go anywhere.
You guys are stuck with me.
Yeah.
Until the intervention. Or the restraining order expires.
We'll have to make sure neither of those things happen.
Yeah, no, I feel pretty fortunate to actually be here. I look forward to coming into this building every day. It's nice to work with a really dedicated group of like-minded professionals, and I look at our constituents and really feel like there's so much we can offer them, and at so many different levels. And I'm happy to invest in the tough ones as much as the ones that are easy. Mm-hmm. It's just different levels of commitment.
Yep.
So
once a Raider, always a Raider.
Yeah, I know. It's funny. It's like everyone said that, like that first year I was here, and I was like, man, it's like, I think I'm joining a cult. And yet it's kind of true. Like, I feel like it kind of seeps into your DNA. Like, I think about it, and I find myself, like kids with hoodies on in the hallway. I'm like, hey, that's the no hoodie rule. And like stuff like that. And like telling kids, like, you should feel proud of being here. These are some of the formative moments of your life. Make them worthwhile.
Thank you.
Cheers. Thanks, boys.
Take care.